I am standing under the flickering fluorescent lights of a bathroom at Miami International Airport. It is 4:30 in the morning. The sink is cold against my hands, and the water dripping from the faucet sounds like a ticking clock. In my right hand, my fingers are crumpled around a thin piece of paper. A one-way economy plane ticket to Seattle. Boarding in exactly 30 minutes. I look at my reflection in the spotted mirror. My eyes are red, my mascara is smudged into dark shadows, and my chest tightens with every breath. But I am not crying anymore. I am just hollow. Have you ever been the punchline to a joke you did not know you were in? Have you ever looked around a room full of people who share your blood and realized you are entirely alone? If you know what that feels like, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Sophia Told Stories. Drop your age and where you are watching from in the comments right now. To understand how I ended up in this airport with 2 suitcases and a ticket to a place I have never been, I need to take you back exactly 6 hours to a private dining room at a country club in Boca Raton, Florida. The air smelled like roasted prime rib and the heavy floral scent of my mother's designer perfume. I sat at the far end of a long mahogany table, smoothing the fabric of my clearance rack dress against my legs. It was supposed to be my graduation dinner. Earlier that afternoon, I walked across the stage to receive my degree in finance. I paid for that piece of paper myself, balancing full-time course loads with 50-hour weeks carrying trays of hot wings and cheap beer at a local sports bar. My mother, Beatrice, sat at the head of the table. She adjusted her diamond tennis bracelet and signaled a waiter for a fresh glass of champagne without glancing in my direction. Next to her was my sister Brittany, scrolling through her phone, her manicured nails tapping against the screen. Brittany drove a brand new Range Rover and spent her days scheduling Pilates classes. Across from her sat her husband Chad, wearing a tailored suit, laughing too loudly with my stepfather Richard. They were the golden circle. I was just the charity case they kept around. I kept my left hand hidden inside my jacket pocket, my thumb tracing the rough, scratched edges of a cheap plastic compass. It was the size of a quarter. My biological father mailed it to me when I was a toddler, right before my mother said he abandoned us to live in a trailer park in the Pacific Northwest. I kept it because it was the only thing I owned that my mother did not buy, and therefore could not hold over my head. Chad leaned across the table, swirling his bourbon. He flashed a brilliant, empty smile. "So, Aubrey, ready to fetch coffee for the Wall Street dropouts? I hear the entry-level jobs pay just enough to cover rent if you skip dinner." Brittany laughed without looking up from her phone. "Leave her alone, Chad. She is going to be a very successful bank teller." I pressed my thumb harder into the plastic compass in my pocket. I forced my mouth into a polite, neutral curve. "I am aiming for corporate acquisitions, actually," I said, keeping my voice steady. Richard snorted, slicing into his steak. "Acquisitions. You need capital for that, Aubrey. Real capital. Not tip money from a diner." I did not argue. Arguing with them was like screaming at a brick wall. I just looked down at my plate, waiting for the evening to end so I could go back to my tiny rented room and sleep. Then my mother picked up her heavy silver spoon. She tapped it gently against the rim of her crystal champagne flute. The sharp, clear ringing sound cut through the low chatter of the country club. The table fell silent. Beatrice offered a bright, practiced smile that did not reach her eyes. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thin, unmarked white envelope. She held it up so the surrounding tables could see what a generous, loving mother she was. "We have a special surprise for our graduate tonight," she announced, her voice carrying across the room. "Since you are so driven and so incredibly independent, we figured it was time you truly spread your wings." She slid the envelope across the polished wood. It stopped right next to my plate. My mother kept her hand submerged inside her pristine leather handbag for what felt like an eternity. The gold clasp had snapped open with a sharp click, echoing over the low hum of country club chatter. But she dragged out the moment, letting the suspense hang heavy in the air. I watched her crimson fingernails brush against the silk lining. My pulse thudded in the hollow of my throat. Every time Beatrice dragged out a silence, it meant she was setting a stage. As I sat there, gripping the edge of the mahogany table, my chest tightened with a familiar, suffocating anxiety. Watching her dig for my supposed graduation gift brought a bitter taste to the back of my mouth. It took me right back to a Tuesday afternoon exactly 4 weeks ago, standing on the thick Persian rug of my stepfather's home office, begging for my future. I had been one signature away from not graduating at all. The university bursar placed a sudden hold on my account for a remaining balance of $2,000. It was a minor administrative fee pileup, but without it cleared, they would not release my diploma or let me walk across the stage. I did not ask Beatrice and Richard for cash. I only asked for a simple co-signature on a short-term student loan extension. I already had the paperwork printed, the pen capped and ready in my trembling hand. They did not even look at the documents. Richard sat behind his heavy oak desk, swirling a glass of scotch, while my mother stood by the window, inspecting a minor blemish on a potted orchid. Richard told me, in a tone usually reserved for dismissing a valet, that his credit was currently locked up. He claimed they needed every ounce of liquid leverage to back Chad on a new commercial real estate acquisition down in Miami. I remembered standing there, my cheap sneakers sinking into their expensive rug, feeling a cold wave of betrayal wash over me. I knew exactly what acquisition Richard was talking about, because I was the one who balanced the books for it. For 3 years, I acted as the family's unpaid bookkeeper. I spent my weekends hunched over a laptop at my kitchen table, organizing their chaotic ledgers, tracking their expenditures, and catching costly errors that their high-priced accountants routinely missed. I never signed any official tax documents, carefully protecting myself from legal liability, but I saw every single cent that flowed through their hands. I knew Chad's Miami project was a ticking time bomb. Chad had walked into the home office right as Richard denied my loan. He wore a pastel polo shirt, looking sunburnt and smug, fresh off the golf course. Before I could stop myself, the frustration boiled over. I turned to Chad and told him the truth. I warned him that the mezzanine loan he was using to bridge the gap on the Miami property was predatory. I had read the fine print. I recited the terms from memory, pointing out the aggressive interest rate escalators and the ruthless default clauses that would trigger a total asset seizure if he missed a single development milestone. I handed him the financial reality on a silver platter, trying to save the family from their own reckless greed. Chad did not thank me. He let out a loud, grating laugh, shaking his head as if I were a child pretending to play business. He looked down his nose at me and called me a textbook amateur. He told me that state school finance majors did not understand how real-world leverage worked, and that I should stick to fetching coffee and balancing checkbooks. Richard smiled in agreement. My mother finally turned away from her orchid, offering a thin sigh of annoyance, and told me to figure out my little school problem on my own. I left the office that day with my unsigned paperwork and a burning knot in my stomach. To cover that $2,000 gap, I picked up every discarded shift at the sports bar. I worked until 2 a.m, smelling like stale fry grease and spilled beer, then went home to study for my final exams until the sun came up. I slept 3 hours a night for a month. I ran my body into the ground, surviving on cheap coffee and sheer willpower, just so I could earn the right to wear a cap and gown today. Now the memory faded, snapping me back to the present reality of the dining room. My mother finally pulled her hand out of her designer bag. Chad caught Richard's eye across the table and winked. Brittany finally looked up from the glowing screen of her phone, a slow, knowing smirk spreading across her glossy lips. The air in the room shifted. A heavy, suffocating anticipation settled over our end of the table. They all knew what was happening. They were all in on the joke, waiting for the punchline to land. I felt the familiar sting of gaslighting creeping up my spine. For years, I told my therapist about the subtle cruelties, the veiled insults, the way they isolated and diminished me. And for years, the family managed to spin my reactions, calling me overly sensitive, dramatic, or ungrateful. They always played the victims whenever I dared to call out their malice. Not tonight. I slipped my left hand off the table and let it drop into my lap. Under the safety of the heavy white tablecloth, my fingers found the cold metal edge of my phone resting in my jacket pocket. Muscle memory took over. I pressed the side button to wake the screen, swiped up blindly, and tapped the lower right corner where I kept my voice memo application. My thumb found the large record button. A subtle vibration confirmed the app was running. The digital receipt was rolling. If they were going to humiliate me, I was going to capture every single word. Beatrice stood up from her chair. She smoothed the front of her tailored silk blouse, making sure she had the attention of the surrounding guests. Several people from the neighboring tables turned their heads, their forks pausing in midair, drawn in by the magnetic pull of her practiced charm. She held a stark white envelope between her index and middle finger, waving it gently, like a flag of surrender that belonged to someone else. She offered a bright, hollow smile that stretched the skin tight across her cheekbones. "We are just so proud of the woman you have become, Aubrey," she projected, ensuring her voice carried to the wealthy onlookers. "You have always insisted on doing things your own way, without our help." She took a slow, deliberate step toward me. The chatter in the room dialed down to a hush. "Since you are so determined to be independent," Beatrice continued, her tone dripping with a honeyed venom that only I could truly recognize, "we figured it was time you truly spread your wings." She reached across the polished wood and dropped the thin envelope directly onto my dinner plate. It landed with a soft, hollow thud against the porcelain. I stared at the stark white envelope resting on my dinner plate. The country club logo was embossed in the top left corner, a subtle reminder of the world my mother inhabited, a world that required an initiation fee equal to 3 years of my tuition. The room around me felt unnaturally still, despite the clinking of crystal and the low murmur of nearby conversations. The only sound that mattered was the erratic thumping of my own pulse in my ears. Beatrice leaned back in her chair, lifting her chin with the poise of a queen observing a peasant. "Go on, Aubrey. Open it. We want to see your face." I slid my index finger under the unsealed flap. The paper was thick, expensive stock. I pulled out a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. As I unfolded it, the bold black ink seemed to swim before my eyes. It was an itinerary, a digital boarding pass printed out. Passenger, Aubrey Susan. Departure, Miami International Airport. Destination, Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. Time, 5:00 a.m. Type, one-way economy. I looked at the date. Tomorrow. No, not tomorrow. In exactly 8 hours. A sharp, barking laugh broke the silence at our table. It was Chad. He slapped the mahogany wood with his open palm, his face turning pink with amusement. "Oh man, Beatrice, you actually did it. You actually bought the ticket." Brittany giggled, finally putting her phone face down on the table. She picked up her champagne flute, taking a delicate sip to hide her smirk. "Well, Aubrey did say she wanted to go into corporate acquisitions. Maybe she can acquire a job managing a coffee stand out there. It rains a lot, right? Perfect weather for broke girls." I looked up from the itinerary. My eyes met my mother's. There was no warmth there, no trace of maternal affection, just the cold, calculated satisfaction of a predator who had finally cornered her prey. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I tried to keep it steady, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a tremor. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He interlaced his fingers, smiling like a benevolent patriarch delivering a hard truth. "It is exactly what it looks like, kiddo. A one-way ticket to reality." He paused, letting the words sink in. He glanced around, making sure the neighboring tables were paying attention to his performance. "We even made a phone call for you," Richard continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "We tracked down your deadbeat dad, you know, Jonathan, the one who could not handle the pressure of raising you. He said he has got a couch in his trailer for you. It might smell like stale cigarettes, but beggars cannot be choosers, right? The laughter that followed was not just from our table. I could hear the muffled chuckles of the country club guests sitting nearby. 30 pairs of eyes were locked onto me. 30 witnesses watching my public execution. These were people who smiled at me in passing, who complimented my work ethic when they saw me waiting tables in town. Now they were participating in the spectacle of my humiliation, entertained by the drama unfolding over their roasted prime rib. I sat frozen. The shock was not hot or explosive. It was a cold, creeping numbness that started in my fingertips and spread upward, paralyzing my vocal cords. Beatrice adjusted her napkin, looking at me with an expression of performative pity. "Aubrey, you have to understand. You are an adult now. You have your degree. It is time you stopped leaning on us." Leaning on you, I thought. I bought my own textbooks. I paid my own phone bill. I filed your taxes for free. Furthermore, Beatrice added smoothly, waving her manicured hand dismissively, Brittany and Chad are expecting their first child soon. We need the space. Your childhood bedroom is going to be converted into a Pilates studio and a nursery overflow room. The contractors arrive tomorrow at 9 in the morning. So, you really do have to be gone by dawn. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. This was not a spontaneous joke. This was a coordinated eviction. They had planned this for weeks. They waited until the exact moment I thought I was celebrating an achievement to cut the floor out from under me. They were throwing me away, and they were disguising it as a graduation gift. I did not scream. I did not flip the table or shatter my water glass against the wall. The anger I felt was too vast, too profound for a cheap theatrical display. I experienced a moment of chilling, absolute clarity. I saw them not as my family, but as a collection of petty, status-obsessed strangers who used my presence to make themselves feel superior. I reached into my pocket. My thumb pressed the stop button on my phone. The voice memo saved automatically. 4 minutes and 32 seconds of audio. The sound of their laughter, the cruelty of their jokes, the precise wording of my eviction. I had the digital receipt. I did not know what I would do with it, but I knew I would never let them rewrite this night. I stood up slowly. I did not take my purse, because it was empty anyway. I did not take the cloth napkin off my lap. I simply let it fall to the floor. "Are you throwing me out?" I asked quietly. Beatrice offered one final, devastating smile. "We are launching you, darling." I picked up the itinerary from the dinner plate. I folded it carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket, right next to the cheap plastic compass my father had sent me 20 years ago. The compass was supposed to point north, but right now, it felt like a heavy anchor dragging me toward an unknown abyss. I did not say goodbye. I turned my back on the mahogany table, on the crystal glasses, on the 30 witnesses, and walked out of the dining room. I kept my spine straight and my chin up, feeling their stares burning into my back until the heavy oak doors of the country club swung shut behind me. Outside, the Florida humidity hit me like a physical blow. The night air was thick and suffocating, smelling of damp asphalt and blooming jasmine. I walked across the manicured parking lot to my beat-up 12-year-old Toyota, the only car I owned, the one with the cracked windshield and the failing transmission. I sat behind the steering wheel and stared at the digital clock on the dashboard. 8:15 p.m. I had exactly 6 hours to pack my entire life into 2 suitcases. 6 hours to dismantle 22 years of existence in a house where I was never truly wanted. 6 hours before I had to drive to the airport and board a flight to a city I did not know to find a man who had abandoned me 2 decades ago. The drive back to the house was a blur of neon streetlights and blinding headlights. I operated on pure adrenaline, my mind racing through logistics, shutting down any emotional response that threatened to break my focus. I could not afford to cry. Crying took time, and time was the one thing I did not have. I arrived at the sprawling, silent mansion. The driveway was empty. They were still at the club, drinking champagne and celebrating my departure. I walked through the grand foyer, past the abstract paintings my mother bought to impress her friends, past the formal living room where I was never allowed to sit, and climbed the sweeping staircase to my bedroom. The room was small, tucked away at the end of the hall, a space they rarely entered. I pulled 2 large, scuffed suitcases from the closet and laid them open on the bed. I did not pack any clothes my mother had purchased. I left the designer sweaters she bought me on sale, just so she could brag about shopping for her daughter. I packed the faded jeans I bought with my own tips. I packed my textbooks, my finance notes, my laptop. I packed the cheap plastic compass. I worked in silence, the only sound the rhythmic zipping of canvas and the rustling of paper. By 2 a.m, the room was bare. All traces of Aubrey Susan were erased, ready to be replaced by yoga mats and mirrored walls. I left one item behind. On the center of the stripped mattress, I placed a printed spreadsheet. It was a detailed breakdown of the corporate taxes I had organized for Chad over the last 3 years. The final row highlighted a number in bold, black ink: $15,000. The amount I had saved them in accounting fees. It was my final receipt. I carried the suitcases down the stairs, the wheels bumping softly against the carpet. I loaded them into the trunk of the Toyota, started the engine, and drove away from the only home I had ever known. Which brings me back to the flickering lights of the airport bathroom. 4:30 a.m. The final boarding call echoes through the PA system. Passenger Aubrey Susan, please proceed to gate 14 immediately. I splash cold water on my face, grab my carry-on bag, and walk out into the terminal. My chest is tight. My hands are shaking. I am terrified of what awaits me in Seattle. I am terrified of navigating a rusted trailer park, of confronting a man who chose not to be a father. But as I hand my boarding pass to the gate agent and step onto the jet bridge, one thought crystallizes in my mind, sharp and undeniable. They thought they were destroying me. They thought they were sending me to the bottom. I find my seat in the cramped economy cabin, buckle my belt, and close my eyes as the plane accelerates down the runway. The engine roars, the wheels leave the tarmac, and the suffocating humidity of Florida falls away. I am not destroyed. I am just beginning. The drone of the commercial jet engines vibrated through the thin cabin walls, a relentless hum that rattled my teeth and settled deep into my bones. I sat wedged into a middle seat, somewhere near the back of the economy section, my knees pressed hard against the tray table. The recycled air smelled of stale coffee and exhausted travelers. To my left, a businessman snored softly against the window. To my right, a teenager tapped fiercely on a glowing screen. I stared straight ahead at the frayed fabric of the seat in front of me, trapped in a metal tube rocketing thousands of feet above the earth, moving further and further away from the only life I had ever known. I closed my eyes, but sleep was impossible. Every time my mind drifted, the image of my mother's manicured hand sliding that white envelope across the mahogany table flashed behind my eyelids. I pressed my hand against my jacket pocket, feeling the firm outline of the plastic compass resting against the printed itinerary. Jonathan Sterling. Just thinking his name felt like committing a crime. In my mother's house, Jonathan was not a person. He was a weapon Beatrice wielded whenever I stepped out of line. A cautionary tale deployed to remind me of my inherent flaws. Growing up, I was never allowed to ask why he left or where he went. Beatrice offered the story unprompted, usually over a glass of expensive Pinot Noir, when she wanted to entertain her country club friends with a tale of her own martyrdom. According to the narrative my mother meticulously crafted, my biological father was a worthless addict who buckled under the pressure of parenthood before I could even walk. She painted a vivid, pathetic picture of him, a man who blew his meager construction paychecks on cheap liquor, dodging child support enforcement by fleeing across the country to hide in the damp, unforgiving pine forests of the Pacific Northwest. Beatrice claimed he lived in a rusted-out aluminum trailer, the kind sinking into the mud with a tarp draped over a leaking roof. She told me he was a deadbeat who never wanted a daughter, a man who chose his vices over his own flesh and blood. I absorbed those stories. They shaped my entire identity. When Richard mocked me at the graduation dinner, joking about the stale cigarette smell of Jonathan's couch, he was simply reciting the family lore. For 22 years, I believed I was the unwanted offspring of a profound failure. The only physical evidence I possessed to challenge that narrative was the cheap plastic compass hidden in my pocket. It arrived in the mail on my 5th birthday in a plain brown package with a Seattle postmark. Beatrice tried to throw it away, calling it a pathetic piece of junk. But I dug it out of the trash bin later that night. I kept it hidden in a sock drawer for over a decade. It was flimsy, the needle barely functioned, but it was proof that at least for one day, he remembered I existed. Now I was flying directly into the heart of that dark mythology. I spent the 5-hour flight calculating my survival. I had exactly $142 in my checking account. I did not know Jonathan's address. I did not even know his phone number. The ticket my mother purchased merely deposited me in his state, a cruel geographical dumping ground. I assumed I would have to use a public terminal computer to search for his name in local directories, hoping he still lived in whatever rural outskirts Beatrice had described. I braced myself for the reality of knocking on a rotting door, facing a stranger ravaged by decades of hard living, and begging for a corner of his floor to sleep on until I could find a minimum wage job. The seatbelt chime rang out, sharp and sudden, pulling me from my spiraling thoughts. The pilot announced our initial descent into Washington. I leaned slightly to catch a glimpse out the small acrylic window. The endless blue sky of the upper atmosphere gave way to a thick, bruised ceiling of dark gray clouds. As the plane broke through the overcast layer, water immediately began streaking horizontally across the glass. The Seattle landscape materialized below, a dense expanse of deep green evergreens and steel-colored waterways, all shrouded in a heavy, unrelenting rain. The contrast to the blinding, humid sunshine of Florida was jarring. It looked exactly how I felt, cold, gray, and unwelcoming. The wheels hit the tarmac with a harsh jolt, throwing my weight forward against the harness. The engines roared in reverse thrust, shaking the entire cabin as we slowed to a crawl. "Welcome to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport," the flight attendant announced over the intercom, her voice weary. "The local time is 8:30 in the morning, and the weather outside is 52 degrees and raining." I unbuckled my belt and reached into my pocket to turn on my cell phone. The screen illuminated, searching for a cellular signal. Within seconds, the device buzzed sharply in my palm. A single text message notification popped up on the lock screen. It was from Brittany. I stared at my sister's name, my chest tightening. Against my better judgment, I tapped the screen to read the message. "Hope the flight was smooth. Do not forget to write from the slums." I locked the phone and slid it back into my pocket. There was no anger left in me, just a profound, hollow exhaustion. Her cruelty was so predictable, so deeply ingrained in her nature, that it barely even stung anymore. It just confirmed that leaving that house, even by force, was the only way I would ever survive. I joined the slow, shuffling procession of passengers filing out of the cabin and stepping onto the jet bridge. The air inside the terminal was crisp, carrying the faint scent of roasted coffee beans and damp wool coats. I kept my head down, avoiding eye contact with the families greeting each other at the gate, focusing only on the bright yellow signs directing the crowd toward baggage claim. I rode the escalator down to the lower level. The carousel groaned to life, spitting out luggage onto the metal tracks. I waited 20 agonizing minutes before spotting my 2 battered, scuffed suitcases. They looked pathetic circulating among the sleek, hard-shell designer luggage of the other travelers. I hauled them off the belt, the handles biting into my palms, and dragged them toward the exit doors. Beyond the glass, the rain was coming down in sheets, blurring the headlights of the cars lined up at the passenger pickup curb. I steered my luggage toward a row of digital kiosks near the exit, desperate to find a public transportation map. I needed to figure out which bus routes headed toward the cheaper, rural fringes of the county. I imagined standing at an uncovered bus stop in the freezing rain, dragging my bags through the mud, searching for a rusted trailer park hidden behind a wall of pine trees. I steeled my spine, taking a deep breath, preparing to face the gritty, unforgiving reality of my new life. Then a voice cut through the terminal noise. "Miss Sterling?" The sound was crisp, polite, and undeniably directed at me. I froze, my hand resting on the handle of my suitcase. No one called me Sterling. My legal last name was Susan, my mother's maiden name. Beatrice erased Jonathan's name from my birth certificate the moment the ink was dry. I turned around slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. I expected to see a grizzled, older man smelling of stale tobacco, wearing worn-out denim and boots, perhaps holding a piece of cardboard with my name scrawled in marker. I expected the ghost my mother had conjured. Instead, standing 5 feet away from me was a man in his late 30s. He wore a pristine, impeccably tailored charcoal suit. His shoes were polished to a high shine, and his posture was rigid, exuding quiet authority. In his gloved hands, he held a sleek digital tablet. The bright screen displayed 3 words in elegant, bold typography: Aubrey Susan Sterling. I blinked, my mind struggling to process the visual contradiction. The man lowered the tablet, offering a warm, professional smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. I stood frozen on the linoleum floor, the roar of the baggage carousel fading into the background, staring at the tailored suit and the glowing screen. The foundation of the reality my mother had built for me cracked, splitting wide open right there in the airport terminal. I took a hesitant step forward, my knuckles turning white around the plastic handle of my cheap suitcase. The bright terminal lights reflected off the sleek digital tablet in the hands of the stranger. My mind raced to construct a logical explanation. Richard and Chad had money to burn, and they possessed a cruel, theatrical sense of humor. They probably hired a local actor to meet me at the baggage claim, a final act of psychological torture meant to raise my hopes before dumping me on the sidewalk. I scanned the bustling crowd, half expecting my stepfather to step out from behind a concrete pillar with a mocking grin. "Are you looking for me?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly over the ambient roar of the airport. The man lowered the tablet. He did not laugh. He did not break character. Instead, his posture softened, and he offered a respectful, deferential nod. "Miss Sterling," he said, his tone carrying a quiet gravity. "Your father has been waiting a very long time for this day. My name is Thomas. I am his private chauffeur. Please allow me to take your bags." He reached out smoothly, taking the heavy, scuffed luggage from my trembling hands. He carried them as if they held precious cargo, entirely unfazed by the frayed zippers and peeling canvas. I stood paralyzed, unable to process the title he had bestowed upon me. No one had ever called me Miss Sterling. I felt like an imposter stepping into a parallel universe, wearing a clearance rack dress and damp sneakers. "Follow me, please," Thomas instructed gently, gesturing toward the automatic exit doors. We walked out into the biting chill of the Washington morning. The rain was unrelenting, drumming a steady rhythm against the concrete awning. Thomas produced a large black umbrella, opening it with a sharp snap, and held it carefully over my head. He guided me past the standard taxi queue, past the chaotic rideshare pickup zones, and directed us toward a secluded VIP lane where a single vehicle sat idling. It was not a rusted pickup truck. It was a midnight black Maybach. The vehicle was an imposing fortress of luxury. Rainwater beaded and rolled off the impeccably waxed exterior. The windows were tinted so deeply they resembled slabs of obsidian, revealing nothing of the interior. Thomas opened the rear passenger door for me. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, the fear of a trap still lingering in the back of my mind, before stepping inside and sinking into the plush seating. The heavy door closed, severing the chaotic noise of the airport instantly. The cabin was a sanctuary of silence, smelling of rich leather and faint polished cedar. I ran my fingertips over the immaculate stitching of the armrest, my damp shoes sinking into the thick lamb's wool floor mats. A glass partition separated the rear cabin from the driver. Thomas slid into the front seat, tapped a button to lower the glass slightly, and offered me a chilled bottle of water from a hidden compartment. The engine engaged with a barely perceptible purr, and we glided away from the curb. I stared out the window as the airport fell behind us. We merged onto the highway, heading north. The gray mist parted occasionally to reveal the towering skyline of the city, sharp steel and glass monuments piercing the overcast sky. We crossed a vast floating bridge, the dark, choppy waters of Lake Washington stretching out on either side. The urban sprawl began to fade, replaced by lush, dense pine forests, manicured hedges, and winding roads that whispered of quiet, old money. The silence inside the cabin grew heavy, pressing against my chest. My anxiety twisted into deep confusion. My mother had always painted a vivid picture of extreme poverty whenever she mentioned my biological father. She described leaking roofs, unpaid bills, and a squalid existence on the fringes of society. Nothing about this car, or this man driving it, aligned with the narrative Beatrice had hammered into my brain for 2 decades. I cleared my throat, forcing myself to break the quiet. "Thomas," I said, staring at the back of his neat collar, "how far is the trailer park from here?" Thomas glanced up, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. His brow furrowed, a flicker of genuine bewilderment crossing his features. "Trailer park," he repeated, testing the words as if they belonged to a foreign language. He let out a warm, rumbling chuckle that filled the car. It was not a mocking sound, but one of profound amusement mixed with sudden understanding. "Miss Sterling, I am afraid someone has provided you with a rather fictional geography," Thomas said, his voice gentle. "Your father does not live in a trailer park. He resides in Medina." I frowned, tracing the condensation on my water bottle. What does he do for a living, exactly? "Jonathan Sterling is the principal founder of Sterling Capital," Thomas explained, steering the long vehicle around a sweeping curve. "It is a venture capital firm. He funds technology startups and commercial acquisitions across the Pacific Northwest. He is quite well known in the financial sector." The words hung in the air, cold and sharp. Venture capital, acquisitions, founder. A new, terrifying layer of conflict ignited in the pit of my stomach. My mother had lied about his poverty, yes, but that lie birthed a much darker reality. If Jonathan Sterling was a titan of finance, if he possessed the wealth to dispatch a chauffeur-driven Maybach on a Tuesday morning, then a terrifying question demanded an answer. Why did he leave me in Florida to be my mother's unpaid servant? The familiar sting of victimhood mutated into a burning, furious betrayal. While I was working triple shifts, smelling of stale fry grease, scrambling to pay a $2,000 tuition bill, my biological father was sitting on a mountain of corporate wealth. While Chad ridiculed my degree and Beatrice treated me like an unwanted stray, Jonathan possessed the power to save me. He had the resources to pull me out of that toxic mansion, yet he chose to remain hidden behind the pine trees of Washington. Beatrice was cruel, but I expected cruelty from her. Jonathan was a coward. I reached into my pocket, my fingers wrapping around the cheap plastic compass. For 20 years I cherished this piece of junk, believing it was the best an impoverished, struggling father could offer his distant daughter. Now, it felt like an insult. A pathetic crumb tossed from a billionaire's table. My jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached. I prepared myself for a confrontation, building a fortress of anger around my heart, ready to demand answers from a man who abandoned me to the wolves while he built an empire. The Maybach slowed, turning off the main road onto a private drive flanked by towering Douglas firs. A colossal stone wall emerged from the mist, stretching endlessly into the forest. We approached a set of towering wrought iron gates. Thomas pressed a button on his sun visor. The heavy metal gates swung open silently, granting us passage into a hidden world. The vehicle rolled onto a circular driveway covered in crushed gravel, the tires crunching softly beneath us. Through the rain-slicked windshield, a sprawling waterfront estate came into view. It was a masterpiece of architectural glass, dark timber, and natural stone, perched perfectly on the edge of the lake. The car glided to a smooth stop at the base of wide, sweeping stone steps leading to the main entrance. The heavy oak front doors were already thrown wide open. Standing under the grand portico, sheltered from the relentless rain, was a distinguished man with silver hair. He wore tailored slacks and a simple cashmere sweater. He did not look like a ruthless corporate titan. He did not project intimidation or cold authority. He looked broken. His hands were trembling visibly at his sides. He made no effort to wipe his face, letting the tears stream freely down his weathered cheeks. His gaze locked desperately onto the dark-tinted window of the rear passenger door. He was looking right at me, waiting for me to step into the light. Thomas brought the Maybach to a gentle halt. He stepped out quickly, opening his umbrella, before walking around to my side of the vehicle. The heavy door swung open, and the crisp, pine-scented air of Washington rushed in, a sharp contrast to the stale atmosphere of the airplane and the suffocating humidity I had left behind in Florida. I stepped onto the crushed gravel of the driveway. The rain drummed a steady, rhythmic beat against the umbrella Thomas held over me, but I barely registered the sound. My entire focus was anchored on the man standing under the grand portico of the estate, Jonathan Sterling. He was taller than I had imagined, though his shoulders carried a slight stoop, the kind born from carrying invisible burdens rather than age. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, his face lined with the deep grooves of a life intensely lived. But it was his eyes that caught me. They were the exact same shade of hazel as mine. He took a hesitant step forward, leaving the shelter of the portico. The rain instantly began to soak the shoulders of his cashmere sweater, but he did not seem to notice. He stopped a few feet away from me, his hands still trembling slightly at his sides. "Aubrey," he breathed. His voice was rough, choked with an emotion so raw it felt almost invasive to witness. I stood, frozen. A lifetime of narrative spun by my mother screamed that this man was a phantom, a failure, a ghost who chose his own weakness over me. Yet the reality standing before me was a titan of finance, a man of immense power, weeping openly in his own driveway. The cognitive dissonance was deafening. Before I could construct a single sentence, Jonathan closed the distance between us. He reached out, his movements careful and deliberate, as if I were made of fragile glass. When I did not pull away, he wrapped his arms around me. The embrace was not tentative. It was fierce, anchoring. The kind of embrace a person gives when they have found something they believed was lost forever. I stood rigid for a moment, the cold rain misting my face, my mind struggling to reconcile the warmth of his hold with the bitter resentment I had carried across the country. Slowly, almost against my own volition, my arms lifted. I returned the embrace, burying my face in the damp wool of his sweater. He smelled of cedar and rain, a scent that felt inexplicably familiar, like a memory buried too deep to retrieve. "Come inside," Jonathan murmured, pulling back gently, his hands resting on my shoulders. "You must be exhausted." Thomas silently gathered my scuffed suitcases and followed us up the wide stone steps. The interior of the Sterling estate was a study in quiet grandeur. High vaulted ceilings, dark timber beams, and expansive walls of glass offering panoramic views of the stormy lake. It was a home designed for power and peace, two things my mother's chaotic, status-obsessed mansion in Boca Raton sorely lacked. Jonathan led me down a wide hallway, our footsteps muffled by thick, hand-woven runners. He stopped before a set of towering double doors, pushing them open to reveal a magnificent library. The room smelled of old paper and leather bindings. Floor-to-ceiling shelves groaned under the weight of thousands of volumes. In the center of the room sat a massive antique oak desk. He gestured toward a plush leather armchair opposite the desk. I sank into it, the soft material enveloping me. Jonathan walked around the desk, but he did not sit. He stood by the window, staring out at the rain-whipped surface of the lake for a long moment. When he finally turned to face me, the fragile joy of our reunion had vanished, replaced by a deep, agonizing sorrow. I imagine you have many questions, Aubrey, he said quietly. I looked down at my hands, my fingers twisting the damp fabric of my skirt. The burning question, the one that had tormented me during the entire flight, clawed its way up my throat. "Why did you wait?" I asked, my voice cracking on the final word. I forced myself to look him in the eye. If you had this life, if you had this wealth, why did you leave me in Florida? Why did you let her treat me like a servant? Why did you wait until I was 22 to save me? Jonathan flinched as if I had struck him. He closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. He walked over to the heavy oak desk, unlocked a lower drawer with a small brass key, and pulled out a thick, leather-bound binder. He carried the binder to the coffee table situated between our chairs and laid it down gently. "I never wanted to leave you, Aubrey," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I fought for you. I fought until I had nothing left to fight with." He opened the binder. It was filled with hundreds of documents, each one protected in a clear plastic sleeve. Bank transfer receipts, legal correspondence, court filings, private investigator reports. It was a meticulous archive of a war I never knew existed. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a document dated 15 years ago. It was a court order, a custody agreement. My mind flashed back to the narrative my mother had spun. She claimed he fled in the dead of night, dodging child support, choosing a life of destitution over responsibility. The reality, laid bare in black ink, was entirely different. Beatrice did not just want sole custody, Jonathan explained, his voice thick with suppressed rage. She wanted absolute control. When my firm started gaining traction, when she realized I was building real wealth, she used you as leverage. She threatened a brutal public custody battle. She hired sharks. They manufactured allegations. They threatened to drag a 7-year-old girl through years of psychological evaluations, testimonies, and mudslinging. He paused, his hazel eyes locking onto mine, pleading for understanding. "She promised to destroy your childhood to win, Aubrey. I had a choice. I could fight her and let you be collateral damage in a war of attrition, or I could surrender. I chose to step away to protect you from the crossfire." I stared at the signature on the court document. His handwriting, sharp and decisive, surrendering his parental rights in exchange for my supposed peace. But that was when I was a child, I argued, the anger still simmering beneath my confusion. Custody ends at 18. Why did you not reach out the second I became a legal adult? You are a billionaire. You have the resources. You could have sent Thomas to my high school graduation. You could have sent a letter. Jonathan's expression crumbled. He turned the pages of the heavy binder, bypassing years of extortion payments, until he reached a single document near the back. He slid it out of the plastic sleeve and handed it to me. "I did send a letter, Aubrey. On your 18th birthday. I sent a certified courier to the house in Boca Raton, requesting to finally see you." I looked down at the piece of paper in my hands. It was a typed letter dated 4 years ago, exactly 1 week after my 18th birthday. It was addressed to Jonathan Sterling. The text was brief, clinical, and devastating. "I am an adult now. I know the choices you made. I have no desire to establish a relationship with a man who abandoned me. Do not contact me again, or I will file for a restraining order." My eyes snapped to the bottom of the page. The signature was mine. I stared at the loops and curves of my own handwriting, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. A wave of nausea washed over me. "I did not write this," I whispered, the paper trembling in my grip. Jonathan leaned forward, his hands resting on his knees. "I know that now. But 4 years ago, I believed it. It carried your signature. It was notarized by a lawyer your stepfather kept on retainer. I thought you hated me. I thought you had absorbed every lie Beatrice ever told you. I stayed away because I believed I was honoring your adult wishes." The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. I was 17. A week before my 18th birthday, Beatrice cornered me in the kitchen. She claimed there was a minor issue with a student bank account she had opened in my name years ago. She shoved a stack of legal documents in front of me, pointing to the highlighted signature lines, tapping her manicured nail impatiently against the paper. She told me to sign them quickly so Richard could file them before the banks closed. I was exhausted from a double shift at the diner. I did not read the fine print. I just signed where she pointed. She forged an emancipation declaration to keep you away, I realized, the full scope of her malice finally coming into focus. She weaponized my own signature to ensure I remained isolated. Why? I asked, the word tearing from my throat. Why go through such elaborate lengths to keep us apart? Jonathan sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. Because she needed you, Aubrey. She needed the tax write-offs. She needed the unpaid labor you provided for Richard and Chad. And most importantly, she needed a scapegoat. She needed someone in that house to feel inferior, so she and Brittany could feel superior. He reached across the coffee table, his large, weathered hand covering my trembling ones. Yesterday, Richard called my private office line, Jonathan continued, his voice hardening into cold steel. He bypassed my assistants. He wanted to gloat. He smugly informed me that they were finally shipping the broke girl off to the trailer park. He said they had squeezed all the use they could out of you, and it was time for you to face the harsh reality of your origins. Jonathan's grip tightened slightly, grounding me. In that single phone call, Richard inadvertently revealed everything. He revealed that Beatrice had lied to you about my financial status for your entire life, ensuring you believed you had no safety net, no alternative. They orchestrated a narrative of poverty to keep you terrified and dependent. The cheap plastic compass in my jacket pocket suddenly felt heavier. The tears did not come as a slow, dignified trickle. They hit me like a tidal wave. I broke down, the sobs tearing from my chest, echoing off the high ceilings of the library. I wept for the terrified girl I was 24 hours ago, boarding a flight to nowhere. I wept for the years of gaslighting, the exhaustion, the relentless cruelty I endured because I believed I was entirely alone in the world. But mostly, I cried from the furious, overwhelming relief of finally being wanted. Jonathan did not offer platitudes. He did not tell me it would be all right. He simply moved from his chair, knelt on the thick rug beside me, and held me as I shattered, offering the quiet, immovable strength of a father who had finally brought his daughter home. I did not sleep for the first 3 days in Seattle. The adrenaline of the truth burned through my veins, incinerating the exhausted girl I used to be. Jonathan offered me the world. He told me I could travel, return to school, or simply rest in the lakeside estate for as long as I needed. I refused. I did not want a vacation. I wanted armor. I asked for a job at his firm. Not a vice presidency, not an executive suite, and certainly not a handout. I demanded the lowest rung on the corporate ladder. I wanted to learn how to wield the kind of financial leverage that made men like Richard and Chad tremble. I dropped my mother's maiden name. On a crisp Monday morning, I walked into the glass-lobbied headquarters of Sterling Capital under a new professional moniker, Aubrey Susan. Junior financial analyst. Nobody on the trading floor knew I was the founder's daughter. To the senior partners, the hedge fund managers, and the risk assessment teams, I was just a hungry state school graduate with a terrifying work ethic. The environment was relentless, operating at a breakneck speed that chewed up and spit out novices. I thrived in it. The grit I developed working triple shifts at a Florida sports bar translated perfectly to the 80-hour weeks of venture capital. I outworked the Ivy League prodigies in my cohort because they worked for a year-end bonus, while I worked for my survival. My meticulous eye for numbers, sharpened by years of auditing Chad's chaotic tax ledgers, became my greatest asset. I dissected tech startups, scrutinized distressed real estate portfolios, and identified market trends that older analysts routinely missed. During my first 6 months, I spotted a hidden liability in a logistics acquisition that saved the firm millions. When I presented my findings to the board, they did not laugh. They did not call me an amateur. They took notes. Jonathan became my mentor. He was demanding but fair, teaching me the intricate architecture of wealth generation. We spent late nights in his office, reviewing term sheets over cold takeout, dissecting the psychology of negotiation. He showed me how to read the fear in a desperate seller and how to identify the hubris in an overconfident buyer. For the first time in my life, I experienced unconditional parental pride. It felt strange at first, like a phantom limb, but his quiet encouragement slowly knitted the broken pieces of my confidence back together. He did not praise me for my compliance or my silence. He praised my intellect, my ruthlessness, and my vision. On my second anniversary at the firm, I earned my first major promotion to senior analyst, securing my own corner office overlooking the Puget Sound. When I unlocked the door on Monday morning, a small, square frame hung on the wall directly behind my mahogany desk. Inside the sleek glass was not a diploma or a prestigious industry award. It was the $89 one-way economy flight itinerary my mother had thrown onto my dinner plate. Jonathan had preserved the wrinkled piece of paper. A polished silver plaque attached to the bottom of the frame read a simple inscription: the ticket to everything. It became my daily grounding mechanism. Whenever a high-stakes negotiation stalled or a rival firm tried to intimidate me, I would look over my shoulder at that piece of paper. I would remember the hollow humiliation of the country club, the terrified girl packing her life into 2 scuffed suitcases, and the bitter rain on the airport tarmac. I realized I had already survived the worst betrayal imaginable. A hostile corporate takeover was nothing in comparison. While I climbed the ranks of Sterling Capital, I built a life outside the glass walls of the firm. I curated a chosen family of peers who loved me without conditions, people who did not care about my net worth or my utility to them. Thomas, the chauffeur who picked me up on day one, became a trusted confidant. We shared coffee on Sunday mornings, discussing everything from vintage cars to literature. I found loyalty in places I never expected. Simultaneously, I maintained total digital silence. I deleted every social media account. I changed my phone number, my email address, and my banking information. I became a ghost to the state of Florida. To Beatrice and Brittany, Aubrey Susan had vanished into the rainy abyss of the Pacific Northwest. In their minds, I was probably scraping chewing gum off the floors of a local diner or sleeping on a stained mattress in a mobile home. I let them believe it. Silence was the ultimate luxury. I owed them no updates on my resurrection, no proof of my success. The best revenge was an opulent life they could not access. 4 years passed, transforming me piece by piece. The terrified 22-year-old girl ceased to exist. At 26, I possessed a razor-sharp instinct for corporate acquisitions. I closed multi-million-dollar deals, restructured failing enterprises, and generated historic returns for the firm. I traded my clearance rack dresses for bespoke, tailored suits that fit like armor. My posture straightened. The constant low-grade anxiety that plagued my youth was replaced by a cold, calculating composure. I was lethal in a boardroom, stripping away the emotional noise to focus purely on leverage and vulnerability. Jonathan called me into the executive boardroom on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The Seattle skyline loomed gray and imposing through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He slid a thick leather folder across the table, offering a familiar, proud smile. I opened the folder to find a new employment contract. Vice President of Acquisitions. I had reached the top tier of Sterling Capital, not by blood, but by merit. I picked up a heavy fountain pen and signed the document, sealing my new identity. I was no longer the invisible servant. I was Aubrey Sterling. But peace is a fragile construct, and the universe has a distinct sense of irony. That very afternoon, my executive assistant buzzed my desk intercom. She informed me that a new distressed asset portfolio had just been submitted for an emergency bailout review. The market was shifting, and over-leveraged firms were beginning to drown. I opened my secure email inbox and clicked on the digital dossier. The sender was a boutique commercial real estate firm teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. I recognized the company logo instantly. It was the same garish, gold-embossed logo I used to format on Excel spreadsheets at my kitchen table in Boca Raton. I scrolled down to the executive summary. The principal signers requesting a $5 million lifeline were Richard and Chad. They were bleeding cash. The predatory mezzanine loan I had warned Chad about 4 years ago had finally detonated, dragging their entire portfolio underwater. They were shopping their toxic assets across the country, desperate for a naive venture capital firm to throw them a rope. They had no idea they had just submitted their financial throats to my desk. The past was not dead. It was broke, and it had just knocked on my door. I stared at the glowing screen of my monitor, the cool, sterile light reflecting off the glass walls of my corner office. The name pulsed at the top of the digital dossier, Chad Hartley, the man who had mocked my state school degree, the man whose fraudulent tax ledgers I had meticulously organized for 3 years without a single cent of compensation. The man who had laughed the loudest when my mother slid that one-way economy ticket onto my dinner plate. The universe, it seemed, had a profound sense of poetic justice. To understand how Chad and Richard ended up in my inbox begging for a $5 million lifeline, you have to understand the specific brand of arrogance that fueled my former family. They did not build wealth, they performed it. Their entire existence was a carefully constructed facade held together by leveraged debt, country club gossip, and the silent, unpaid labor of the daughter they discarded. When I left Florida 4 years ago, I took more than just my clothes and 2 scuffed suitcases. I took the only operational brain in their financial ecosystem. Without me spending my weekends hunched over a laptop, untangling their chaotic bookkeeping, the rot within their portfolio accelerated at a terrifying pace. Chad was a salesman, not a strategist. He possessed a dangerous talent for convincing older, wealthy investors to part with their capital, but he had zero capacity for managing risk. The mezzanine loan I had explicitly warned him about, the one with the aggressive interest rate escalators and ruthless default clauses, finally detonated. I did not need to hire a private investigator to piece together their downfall. The financial footprint of a collapsing real estate empire is loud and remarkably predictable. According to the distressed asset report glowing on my screen, Chad's Miami commercial project, the very acquisition Richard had prioritized over my $2,000 tuition loan, stalled during the foundation phase. The construction delays triggered the aggressive interest penalties I had predicted. The primary lender panicked and called the loan. Chad, lacking any liquid capital to cover the margin, attempted to shuffle funds from Richard's personal investment accounts, creating a cascading domino effect of catastrophic losses. The report detailed a grim reality. Their flagship properties were bleeding cash. Creditors were circling like sharks in bloody water. The sprawling mansion in Boca Raton, the fortress where Beatrice hosted her elite luncheons and planned my eviction, was quietly listed in pre-foreclosure. They were drowning. Yet, true to their nature, they refused to adapt. Instead of downsizing, selling assets, or admitting failure, Beatrice continued to host lavish country club dinners, terrified that her social circle would catch the scent of their impending ruin. Chad doubled down on his delusion, determined to find a bigger fish to swallow his toxic debt, allowing him to maintain the illusion of a successful real estate mogul. He cast a wide net across the country, pitching his sinking portfolio to high-risk venture capital firms. He targeted the Pacific Northwest, assuming the tech money out here was desperate to diversify into Southeast real estate. He aimed blindly into the dark, completely unaware that he was pitching his financial throat directly to the wolf he had created. Chad believed he was communicating with AS, Sterling, a senior acquisition proxy representing the firm's vast capital reserves. His emails, which I read with clinical fascination, were dripping with his trademark brand of condescending bravado. He wrote with the swagger of a man who believed he was doing Sterling Capital a favor by allowing us to absorb his distressed assets. In his correspondence, Chad clearly assumed A.S. Sterling was an aggressive, elderly male executive, a ruthless old titan of industry he could charm and manipulate over a round of golf. He used phrases like gentleman's agreement and legacy partnership, completely oblivious to the fact that the proxy reading his emails was a 26-year-old woman sitting in a bespoke tailored suit, sipping espresso and holding the memory of his cruelty like a loaded gun. I leaned back in my leather chair, the leather creaking softly in the quiet office. This was not a standard acquisition review. This was an opportunity for total psychological severance. I did not want to simply reject their proposal. A rejection would allow them to maintain their delusion, blaming a faceless corporation for their failure. I wanted to dismantle their arrogance face to face. I wanted to rip the mask off their performance and force them to look at the reality they had built. I picked up my desk phone and pressed the intercom button. "Sarah," I said, addressing my executive assistant, "please set up a preliminary video conference with the Hartley Group for tomorrow at 10 in the morning. Inform them that senior partner A.S. Sterling will be joining the call to observe the initial pitch." I paused, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. "And Sarah, please ensure my camera is disabled for the duration of the meeting. I will be operating strictly in a listening capacity." The trap was set. The next morning, at exactly 10 o'clock, the video conference platform chimed. The screen split into two large panels. On the left side, the feed from Boca Raton materialized. The contrast between their projected image and their financial reality was almost comical. Chad and Richard were sitting in Richard's heavy oak-paneled home office, the exact same room where they had denied my student loan 4 years ago. They wore crisp, expensive suits, their hair perfectly styled. The background was meticulously arranged to project stability and generational wealth, featuring leather-bound law books and a bronze globe. They looked like men who commanded empires. I knew, from the forensic accounting report sitting on my desk, that they barely had enough liquid cash to cover the next payroll cycle. My panel remained a solid, imposing black square, displaying only the white text, A.S. Sterling. "Good morning, gentlemen," a male proxy from my junior acquisition team began, acting as the designated speaker while I observed silently. "Thank you for submitting your portfolio to Sterling Capital. Mr. Sterling is on the line, observing our preliminary assessment. The floor is yours." Chad leaned into the camera, deploying his signature brilliant smile. He rubbed his hands together, practically vibrating with the arrogant assumption that he had already won. "Thank you. It is an honor to present to a firm of your caliber," Chad began, his voice slick with practiced charm. "What we have here is a unique, time-sensitive opportunity to acquire a legacy foothold in the premium South Florida commercial sector. The Hartley Group has built a sterling reputation." I listened, my face devoid of expression, as Chad spun a masterful, desperate web of lies. He glossed over the catastrophic interest penalties on the Miami project, framing the stalled construction as a strategic pause for market optimization. He inflated the projected rental yields on their secondary properties by 30%, utilizing accounting tricks I had specifically warned him against using years ago. He presented their staggering debt load not as a liability, but as aggressively leveraged growth potential. Richard chimed in, using his deep, authoritative baritone to lend weight to Chad's fabrications. "We are looking for a strategic partner," Richard intoned seriously. "Someone with the vision to recognize a generational asset. We just need a minor capital injection to bridge a temporary liquidity gap." A temporary liquidity gap. They were asking for $5 million to stop the bank from seizing the very chairs they were sitting on. I listened to them lie for 30 solid minutes. I did not interject. I did not correct their inflated numbers or challenge their fraudulent projections. I let them build their house of cards as high as they dared, taking meticulous notes on a legal pad. Every lie was a brick in the wall of their impending destruction. When Chad finally concluded his pitch, breathless and glowing with self-satisfaction, he leaned back, expecting immediate praise from the black square on the screen. "Well, Mr. Sterling," Chad said smoothly, attempting to project confidence, "what are your thoughts on bringing the Hartley portfolio under the Sterling umbrella?" The junior proxy paused, waiting for my instruction. I moved my fingers across my keyboard, typing a direct, private message to my proxy's monitor. The proxy cleared his throat, his eyes flicking downward to read my text. "The portfolio presents a highly unusual set of variables," the proxy relayed, maintaining a carefully neutral tone. "Mr. Sterling finds the structure of your liabilities to be quite compelling." Chad's smile widened into a triumphant grin. He nudged Richard's arm outside the frame of the camera. He thought he had hooked the whale. "However," the proxy continued, reading my final instruction, "Sterling Capital does not authorize acquisitions of this magnitude based solely on a digital presentation. The discrepancies in your risk assessment require a forensic review. Mr. Sterling invites you to our Seattle headquarters for a final in-person portfolio audit this Friday." The silence from Boca Raton was electric. Chad and Richard exchanged a rapid, wide-eyed glance. An invitation to the Seattle headquarters was not a standard procedure for a routine rejection. In the world of venture capital, an in-person audit by a senior partner was the final hurdle before the wire transfer. "We would be honored," Richard said quickly, his authoritative baritone cracking slightly with desperate relief. "We will book our flights immediately." "Excellent," the proxy concluded. "We look forward to reviewing your legacy in person." The video feed cut out, leaving my office in silence. I closed the laptop, the satisfying click echoing against the glass walls. I turned my chair to look out at the sweeping view of the Puget Sound, the cold, gray water churning under the overcast sky. They thought they were flying to Seattle to swindle a naive billionaire. They believed their performance was flawless, their lies impenetrable. They were about to step into the heart of an empire they did not understand, walking straight into the jaws of the daughter they had discarded like trash. The stage was set for a reunion they would never forget. The digital invitation to Seattle acted like an adrenaline shot, straight into the dying heart of the Hartley Group. Chad and Richard were euphoric. They operated under the arrogant assumption that surviving a preliminary video conference meant the deal was practically sealed. In their minds, an in-person audit by a senior partner was merely a formality, an opportunity to exchange handshakes, play a round of hypothetical golf, and sign the paperwork that would inject $5 million of fresh capital into their suffocating bank accounts. They did not fly alone. Despite drowning in catastrophic debt, Beatrice and Brittany viewed the corporate summons not as a desperate rescue mission, but as a celebratory luxury vacation. They maxed out their last remaining high-limit credit cards to book first-class flights, determined to project an aura of unshakable generational wealth to the Seattle elite. Beatrice, completely oblivious to the forensic reality of their situation, treated the trip as a victory lap. She genuinely believed her husband and son-in-law were about to conquer the Pacific Northwest tech sector with their southern charm and real estate acumen. But Seattle is a city that strips away illusions, both financial and social. Their facade began to crack the moment they landed. Because their liquid assets were entirely depleted, tied up in the frozen Miami project and mounting legal fees, Richard could not secure a reservation at the Four Seasons or the Fairmont Olympic. Instead, the family was forced to check into a mid-tier corporate hotel near the airport, miles away from the gleaming downtown financial district. It was a sterile, beige room with worn carpeting and fluorescent lighting, a stark, humiliating contrast to the sprawling waterfront mansion they were desperately trying to save in Boca Raton. I did not need to be in the room to know exactly how the evening unfolded. The psychology of my former family was as predictable as a mathematical equation. When confronted with their own failure, they always doubled down on delusion. I imagined them huddled in that cramped hotel suite, the constant gray Seattle drizzle slicking the windows outside. There were no crystal champagne flutes or imported caviar. Beatrice and Brittany were likely perched on the edge of a stiff, synthetic mattress, drinking cheap boxed wine out of plastic bathroom cups, trying to maintain their country club superiority in a room that smelled faintly of industrial cleaning supplies. Chad, pacing the narrow space between the television and the mini-fridge, was the primary architect of their collective denial. He fed off the desperation in the room, spinning it into a narrative of impending triumph. He was a salesman to his core, and his most dedicated customers were the people sharing his last name. He unbuttoned his collar, loosening his silk tie, projecting the reckless confidence of a gambler who believed the next hand would erase all his debts. "Do not worry about the accommodations, Beatrice," Chad likely boasted, taking a generous swig from his plastic cup. "By tomorrow afternoon, this entire trip becomes a tax write-off." The Hartley Group is about to secure a legacy partnership. Richard, sitting heavily in the single armchair, nodded in solemn agreement, eager to validate the illusion that kept his own panic at bay. "They bit the hook hard," Richard would add, using his deep, authoritative baritone to mask the slight tremor in his hands. That proxy today was practically salivating over the Miami projections. "They want our portfolio. They need our regional expertise to break into the Southeast market." Chad laughed, a sharp, grating sound that bounced off the cheap walls of the hotel room. He genuinely believed his own pitch. He believed that the forensic audit scheduled for the morning was a mere technicality, an obstacle he could easily overcome with a firm handshake and a few well-placed buzzwords. This A.S. Sterling is probably some out-of-touch dinosaur executive, Chad likely bragged, pacing back and forth. Or worse, some naive tech nepo baby playing with daddy's venture capital fund. They have cash, but they lack street smarts. I am going to walk into that boardroom tomorrow and swindle them blind. I will have them practically begging to absorb our liabilities. Beatrice offered a brittle, appreciative laugh, swirling the cheap wine in her cup. She leaned into the fantasy, eager to return to her elite luncheons in Florida, with tales of how her family had conquered the West Coast financiers. Brittany, scrolling through her phone, probably complained about the lack of decent room service, completely insulated from the reality that the very phone in her hand was weeks away from being disconnected for non-payment. They slept that night wrapped in a blanket of supreme arrogance, entirely ignorant of the intricate snare tightening around their financial throats. They believed they were hunting a wealthy, gullible mark. They did not know they were walking into a slaughterhouse designed specifically for them. The next morning, the gray Seattle weather broke, giving way to a rare, crisp, clear day. The sunlight glinted off the towering glass skyscrapers of the downtown financial district. At exactly 9:45 a.m., a black town car pulled up to the main entrance of the Sterling Capital headquarters. The building was an imposing monument of steel and dark reflective glass, projecting absolute corporate authority. Richard, Chad, Beatrice, and Brittany stepped out onto the pristine sidewalk. They had dressed for war, donning their most expensive, aggressive tailored suits and designer dresses, attempting to mask their desperation with layers of imported fabric. They adjusted their collars, smoothed their lapels, and lifted their chins, deploying the toxic, entitled swagger that had terrorized waiters and country club staff in Florida for decades. They walked through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the sprawling, immaculate lobby of Sterling Capital. The space was intimidating, featuring polished marble floors, massive abstract art installations, and a quiet, humming energy of immense wealth being generated in real time. Chad marched directly to the primary reception desk, flanked by his family, projecting the aura of a man who owned the building. "Good morning," Chad announced loudly, ensuring the passing executives heard his booming voice. "The Hartley Group has arrived. We have a 10 o'clock portfolio audit scheduled with senior partner A.S. Sterling. Please let him know we are ready for the final review." The receptionist, a sharp, impeccably dressed professional, typed their names into her terminal. She did not flinch at his aggressive tone. She simply nodded, offering a polite, neutral smile. "Yes, Mr. Hartley," she replied smoothly. "You are expected on the 40th floor. The executive elevator is directly behind you. Security has already cleared your access." The family exchanged a victorious, smug glance. They had breached the fortress. The money was waiting upstairs. They piled into the sleek wood-paneled elevator, watching the digital numbers climb higher and higher, taking them closer to the executive summit of the firm. They adjusted their ties and reapplied their lipstick, practically vibrating with the anticipation of securing the $5 million check that would save their fraudulent empire. The elevator doors chimed and slid open on the 40th floor, revealing a quiet, deeply luxurious reception area that smelled of polished mahogany and espresso. A junior assistant was waiting to escort them down a long, glass-walled corridor. "Right this way, please," the assistant murmured, leading them toward a set of heavy, frosted glass double doors at the end of the hall. "The senior partner is waiting for you in the primary boardroom." Chad squared his shoulders, ready to deploy his charm. Richard straightened his posture, preparing to project authority. Beatrice and Brittany followed closely behind, eager to witness the financial conquest. The assistant pushed open the heavy doors, granting them entry into a massive corner boardroom. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the Seattle skyline and the churning waters of the Puget Sound far below. A massive polished mahogany table dominated the center of the room. The Toxic family walked in, stepping onto the thick carpet, preparing to demand their salvation. They possessed absolutely no idea who was sitting silently in the high-backed leather chair at the head of the table, facing the window, waiting for the door to close behind them. The heavy frosted glass doors of the primary boardroom swung open, gliding silently on their custom hinges. The space was immense, designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. A long, polished mahogany table stretched across the center, surrounded by ergonomic leather chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows dominated the far wall, offering a sweeping, uninterrupted view of the Seattle skyline and the slate-gray waters of the Puget Sound. I sat at the head of the table, facing the windows. The high back of my executive leather chair completely concealed me from the doorway. I listened to their footsteps sink into the thick, imported carpet. I heard the rustle of expensive, desperate fabric as they settled into the chairs near the center of the table. A junior assistant offered them sparkling water and fresh espresso, murmuring polite pleasantries before retreating and closing the double doors with a soft, definitive click. The room fell quiet, save for the faint hum of the climate control system. "Well," Richard began, his voice booming across the polished mahogany, projecting that familiar, toxic blend of entitlement and false authority. "I must say the view from up here is quite spectacular. It speaks to the level of vision Sterling Capital clearly possesses." He was pitching to the back of my chair, entirely unaware of the identity of the person occupying it. I remained perfectly still, listening to the man who had laughed at my eviction try to charm a faceless corporate entity. "We at the Hartley Group appreciate you taking the time to conduct this final review," Chad chimed in, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the table. His tone was slick, coated in the aggressive confidence of a salesman who believed he was holding a winning hand. "As we discussed during the preliminary conference, our portfolio represents a unique, generational opportunity." I could hear the ice clinking in Beatrice's water glass. She was nervous, but she masked it with a quiet, judgmental hum of approval, eager to support the men who provided her country club status. Brittany shifted in her seat, the subtle rustle of her designer dress betraying her boredom. To her, this was just a boring financial hurdle standing between her and a luxury shopping spree. "Sterling Capital would truly be fortunate to partner with a legacy business like ours," Richard continued, his baritone deepening, reaching for a commanding resonance. "We have deep roots in the Southeast. We understand the market topography in a way that outsider firms simply cannot replicate. We just need to execute this minor capital injection to bridge our temporary liquidity gap and optimize our flagship properties." A minor capital injection, a temporary liquidity gap. The sheer magnitude of their delusion was breathtaking. They were sitting in the epicenter of a multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm asking for $5 million to save them from total ruin. And they still believed they were the ones doing the favor. I placed my hands on the smooth, padded armrests of my chair. I wore a bespoke, midnight blue suit tailored perfectly to my frame, radiating a cold, untouchable authority. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe style, stripping away any trace of the terrified, exhausted girl who had waited tables in Florida. I pressed my foot gently against the floor and slowly swiveled the heavy leather chair around to face the table. The movement caught their attention instantly. The monologue halted. I did not speak right away. I simply looked at them. The visual impact of their reaction was instantaneous and violently satisfying. It happened in terrifying slow motion. Chad's arrogant salesman smile slid off his face like wet clay, his mouth hanging open in a silent, grotesque display of confusion. He blinked rapidly, his eyes darting from my tailored suit to the polished mahogany, as if his brain was furiously attempting to recalibrate reality. Richard froze, his deep baritone catching in his throat, transforming into a strangled, pathetic wheeze. The color drained completely from his face, leaving a sickly, pale hue beneath his expensive tan. He gripped the edge of the table so tightly, his knuckles turned a stark, alarming white. Brittany let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, physically recoiling in her chair. She pressed her hand against her chest, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror, staring at me as if a ghost had just materialized in the corporate boardroom. But it was Beatrice who provided the most visceral reaction. She was raising a small porcelain espresso cup to her lips when our eyes locked. The shock short-circuited her motor functions. Her perfectly manicured fingers simply released their grip. The cup hit the saucer with a sharp crack, teetered, and plummeted onto the polished table. It shattered, sending dark, steaming liquid and jagged shards of white porcelain skittering across the pristine wood. The silence that followed was deafening. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with a suffocating, paralyzing dread. They were not looking at a naive billionaire or an elderly tech executive. They were looking at the daughter they had discarded, sitting at the helm of the very empire they were begging to save them. I did not move to clean up the spilled espresso. I did not flinch. I slowly brought my hands together, resting them lightly on the table in front of me. Sitting precisely between my hands was a heavy, custom-made paperweight. Encased deep within the solid, clear acrylic block was a cheap, plastic compass. The compass was the size of a quarter, its faded needle permanently frozen, pointing toward an invisible north. It was the only object on the vast expanse of the mahogany table, acting as a profound, undeniable symbol of my survival. Beatrice's eyes darted downward, landing on the encased compass. Recognition flared in her gaze, replacing shock with a cold, creeping horror. She recognized the piece of junk she had tried to throw away 2 decades ago. The very object that proved Jonathan Sterling had always existed. "Aubrey," Beatrice finally whispered, her voice a fragile, trembling thread that barely broke the silence. I met her gaze, my expression completely devoid of emotion. I was a predator, observing captured prey, calculating the precise angle of the killing blow. "You are right, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room like a blade. It was perfectly calm, even, and terrifyingly clear. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table, keeping my eyes locked on the men who had mocked my education. "Family legacy is so important," I continued, letting the words hang in the air, allowing them to absorb the full weight of the irony. I reached out and placed my hand on the thick, financial dossier they had submitted for review, the document detailing their impending bankruptcy. "Let us look at your portfolio." The shattered porcelain of the espresso cup lay scattered across the polished mahogany table, a jagged metaphor for the sudden, violent collapse of my mother's reality. The steaming dark liquid pooled slowly, soaking into the pristine white paper of the financial dossier Chad had so proudly presented just moments before. No one moved to clean it up. The 4 of them sat frozen, paralyzed by the cognitive dissonance of seeing the daughter they had discarded sitting at the absolute pinnacle of corporate power. But true to their nature, the paralysis did not last. When confronted with undeniable failure, my former family always retreated to the only survival mechanism they knew: delusion. Beatrice recovered first. She took a sharp, jagged breath, her chest rising against the silk of her designer blouse. She forced her facial muscles into the familiar, hollow mask of country club superiority, desperate to rewrite the narrative before the reality of the situation fully set in. "Aubrey," Beatrice exclaimed, her voice pitching an octave higher than usual, laced with a brittle, artificial warmth. "My God, look at you." She offered a strained, trembling smile, acting as if we had accidentally run into each other at a charity luncheon rather than a multi-million-dollar financial audit. "We knew Jonathan would set you up with a little receptionist job eventually," Beatrice continued, waving her hand dismissively, attempting to diminish my presence in the room. "We always said you just needed a firm hand to get you organized. It is so good to see you making yourself useful." I did not respond. I simply watched her perform, my expression cold and unreadable. I let her hollow words echo against the glass walls of the boardroom, allowing the absurdity of her statement to linger. Chad, ever the opportunistic salesman, seized the opening Beatrice provided. He loosened his silk tie, attempting to project the relaxed, arrogant swagger he had walked in with, though his forehead was now slick with a fine sheen of nervous sweat. "Wow, Aubrey, babe," Chad said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the table, trying to establish a false sense of intimacy. "This is crazy. What a small world, right?" He offered a conspiratorial wink that made my stomach turn. "Listen, since you clearly have the ear of the higher-ups around here," Chad continued, lowering his voice as if we were conspiring against the firm, "be a team player. Tell your boss to expedite the signature on these papers. You know our portfolio is solid. Keep it in the family, right?" He actually believed his own manipulation. He genuinely thought that after 4 years of absolute silence, after mocking my education and laughing at my eviction, he could simply flip a switch and charm me into committing corporate fraud on his behalf. I did not yell. I did not match his frantic, desperate energy. Instead, I reached out and pulled the thick, damp financial dossier away from the spilled espresso. I opened the folder. The sound of turning paper was terrifyingly loud in the quiet room. "I am not the receptionist, Chad," I said, my voice low, steady, and devoid of any familial warmth. "And I do not need to ask my boss for permission to reject your proposal. I am the senior partner of acquisitions. I am A.S. Sterling. I make the final decision on whether this firm absorbs your liabilities." The silence returned, heavier this time. Chad swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. The reality was finally beginning to penetrate his thick skull. He was not pitching to a naive billionaire or an elderly executive. He was pitching to the woman whose intelligence he had consistently ridiculed. "Let us discuss this legacy business of yours," I continued, tapping my pen against the edge of the open dossier. I did not need to review the papers. I already knew the numbers intimately. Because I spent my college weekends acting as their unpaid bookkeeper, I knew the structural integrity of the Hartley Group better than they did. I knew exactly where the financial bodies were buried. "You stated in your preliminary presentation that the stalled construction on the Miami project was a strategic pause for market optimization," I said, flipping to the specific page detailing their flagship disaster. I looked directly at Chad, stripping away his salesman facade with clinical precision. "That is a lie. The project stalled because the primary lender issued a cease and desist order after discovering you misappropriated the construction escrow funds to cover margin calls on Richard's failing equity portfolio." Chad's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to protest, but I cut him off smoothly, maintaining absolute control of the room. "Furthermore, you inflated the projected rental yields on your secondary properties by 30%, I continued, my gaze shifting to Richard, who was now staring at me with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. "You utilized the exact same aggressive depreciation schedules I explicitly warned you against using 4 years ago. You did not optimize those properties. You mathematically fabricated their value to secure secondary loans you cannot possibly repay. Richard's deep baritone vanished. He looked like a man who had just watched his empire crumble to dust. And finally, I said, leaning back in my leather chair, closing the dossier with a definitive snap, you are not asking Sterling Capital for a minor capital injection to bridge a temporary liquidity gap. I let the silence stretch for a long moment, ensuring they felt the full weight of their impending ruin. You are drowning in $42 million of highly leveraged, toxic debt, I stated, the number hanging over them like an executioner's blade. You are begging for $5 million in immediate liquid cash simply to prevent the banks from foreclosing on your corporate headquarters and the mansion in Boca Raton by the end of the month. The surgical dismantling of their fraudulent pitch broke the final remnants of their composure. The illusion of the wealthy, sophisticated Florida socialites vanished completely. Richard's true colors finally surfaced. The polished, benevolent patriarch act disintegrated, replaced by the vicious, entitled core that had always defined him. He slammed his fists onto the mahogany table, the force rattling the remaining glassware. You listen to me, you ungrateful little brat, Richard bellowed, his face twisting into a mask of ugly, desperate rage. His deep voice boomed, echoing off the glass walls. You owe us this. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my face. We took you in when that deadbeat coward abandoned you, Richard shouted, the veins bulging in his neck. We put a roof over your head. We fed you. We raised you. You have a duty to this family. You are going to sign that check and bail us out, or I swear I will ruin your reputation in this industry. The tension in the boardroom reached an absolute crescendo. The threat was pathetic, completely devoid of leverage, but it exposed the violent entitlement that had always fueled their treatment of me. He genuinely believed that my existence was a debt I had to repay with my own destruction. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I simply stared at him, observing his tantrum with the detached fascination of a scientist examining a dying specimen. As Richard's empty threats hung in the air, the dynamic in the room shifted again. Beatrice realized that aggression was failing. She recognized that I held the keys to their survival, and Richard was actively throwing them away. She decided to deploy her ultimate weapon. Beatrice let out a sudden, ragged sob. Her hands flew to her face, her shoulders shaking violently. She began to cry, but it was not the quiet, genuine weeping I had witnessed from Jonathan 4 years ago. It was loud, performative, and deeply manipulative. Aubrey, please, Beatrice wailed, her voice cracking with artificial sorrow. She reached across the table, her manicured fingers grasping desperately at the empty air between us. Do not do this to your mother, Beatrice pleaded, tears streaking down her carefully applied makeup. I know we made mistakes. I know we were hard on you. But we did it out of love. We just wanted you to be strong. She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, weaponizing the maternal bond she had spent 2 decades destroying. Brittany is pregnant again, Beatrice cried, pointing a trembling finger at my sister, who was now weeping silently into a tissue. If we lose the house, if Chad goes bankrupt, they will have nothing. They will be on the street. You cannot abandon your family when we need you the most. You just cannot. The performance was masterful. If I were the terrified 22-year-old girl sitting at the country club dinner, the sheer force of her weaponized guilt might have broken me. I might have signed away my future just to earn a scrap of her affection. But the girl she was trying to manipulate died on an airport tarmac 4 years ago. The woman sitting in the executive chair was immune to her tears. I watched the tears streak through the heavy foundation on my mother's cheeks. Her shoulders heaved in a practiced, rhythmic motion designed to elicit maximum sympathy. If I closed my eyes, I could almost picture the younger version of myself rushing to comfort her, apologizing for whatever imaginary slight had caused her distress. But my eyes remained open. I looked at her weeping face and felt nothing but a clinical detachment. "You did not raise me to be strong," I said, my voice cutting through her theatrical sobs. The room grew unnervingly quiet, the sound of her crying dying in her throat as she realized the performance was failing. "You raised me to be your staff," I continued, "and staff requires compensation." I reached out and pressed a silver button embedded in the polished mahogany table. The sleek, high-fidelity speakers integrated into the ceiling of the boardroom hummed to life. I picked up my phone, the same device I had hidden in my lap 4 years ago, and tapped the screen once. The pristine acoustic environment of the Sterling Capitol headquarters was suddenly filled with the ambient noise of a Boca Raton country club, the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, the low murmur of wealthy patrons, and the distinct, grating sound of Chad laughing echoed off the glass walls. Everyone at the table stiffened. They recognized the audio environment immediately. Richard's recorded voice boomed from the overhead speakers, unfiltered and dripping with smug superiority. "We called your deadbeat dad. He said he has got a couch in his trailer for you. It might smell like stale cigarettes, but beggars cannot be choosers, right?" The sound of their collective laughter filled the corporate space. It was a cruel, sharp sound that stripped away their current facade of desperate victims, revealing the vicious predators they had always been. Brittany squeezed her eyes shut, turning her head away from the center of the table. A dark flush of deep shame crept up her neck, staining her cheeks red. Hearing her own malice played back in a professional setting, devoid of the enablers who usually applauded her, shattered her illusion of innocence. Then, Beatrice's recorded voice chimed in, clear and venomous. "Since you are so determined to be independent, we figured it was time you truly spread your wings. Hope you like it, broke girl. We are launching you." I tapped my phone screen again. The audio cut off, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. I looked at my mother. The artificial tears had evaporated. Her jaw was slack, her eyes darting toward the closed double doors as if calculating an escape route. The weaponized guilt she had tried to deploy just moments ago lay dead on the floor, alongside the shattered espresso cup. "You called it a graduation gift," I said, leaning back in my chair. "You framed it as an act of tough love. But we both know that was a convenient lie told to protect your social standing." I reached down to my leather briefcase resting beside my chair. I pulled out a thick, black archival folder. The heavy cardstock felt grounding in my hands. I placed it on the table and slid it across the smooth surface. It stopped exactly halfway between Beatrice and Richard. "Open it," I commanded. Richard hesitated, his hands still trembling from his earlier outburst. Beatrice stared at the folder as if it contained a live explosive. When neither of them moved, Chad, driven by a frantic need to understand the shifting power dynamics, reached over and flipped the cover open. The first document sitting on top of the stack was a bank statement. It was dated 15 years ago, showing a wire transfer of $50,000 from Jonathan Sterling to a private offshore account held solely by Beatrice. Chad frowned, tracing the numbers with his index finger. "What is this?" he asked, his voice wavering. "That is the price of my childhood," I replied, keeping my gaze locked on my mother. For over a decade, Beatrice extorted Jonathan. She threatened to drag a 7-year-old child through a grueling, highly publicized custody battle unless he paid a steep monthly premium to stay away. She funded your country club memberships, your designer wardrobes, and your luxury vehicles with the hush money she squeezed from the man you all called a deadbeat. Brittany let out a soft, choked gasp. She looked at our mother, her eyes wide with a horrifying realization. The wealth they had paraded around Florida, the status they had weaponized against me, was built entirely on a foundation of blackmail. But the extortion was not enough, I continued, my tone dropping into a freezing register. When I approached my 18th birthday, Jonathan had the legal right to contact me without facing a custody dispute. So, Beatrice needed an insurance policy. I pointed to the second document in the folder. Chad turned the page. It was the forged emancipation letter. The paper bearing my signature, dictated under false pretenses, declaring I wanted nothing to do with my biological father and threatening a restraining order. You forced a teenager to sign a document under the guise of an administrative banking error, I stated, the memory fueling the sharp edge of my words. You orchestrated a legal barrier to ensure I would never discover the truth about Jonathan's wealth. You needed to keep me isolated. You needed to keep me convinced that I was a burden, a charity case, with nowhere else to go, so I would continue acting as your unpaid accountant, your maid, and your emotional punching bag. Beatrice opened her mouth, a desperate stammer escaping her lips, but no coherent words formed. The irrefutable proof of her sociopathy was laid out in black ink and bank routing numbers for her favorite son-in-law and golden child to see. The elegant Florida socialite was exposed as a common extortionist. And 4 years ago, the dynamic shifted, I said, resting my elbows on the table and leaning closer. Chad married into the family. He brought the promise of vast real estate riches. Suddenly, my free labor was no longer required. In fact, my presence became an inconvenience. I was asking for a $2,000 co-signature that would have impacted your debt-to-income ratio, just as you were trying to secure a highly leveraged, fraudulent loan for the Miami project. I watched Richard swallow hard, the truth of his financial malpractice hanging heavy over him. I was no longer a useful tax write-off, I concluded, delivering the final verdict. I was a liability. You did not launch me, Beatrice. You exiled me, because you had squeezed every ounce of utility from my bones, and you were too cowardly to look me in the eye and tell me the truth. The sterile, corporate environment of the boardroom offered no shelter for their delusions. There were no country club friends to validate their choices, no expensive wine to dull the sharp edges of reality. They were trapped in a glass cage, forced to examine the grotesque reflection of their own actions. Chad sank back into his chair, running a trembling hand through his hair. The realization that he had tied his financial future to a family built on lies and impending bankruptcy washed over him. His eyes darted to the windows, looking down at the dizzying drop to the Seattle streets below, as if realizing the true depth of the fall that awaited him. Brittany was weeping silently, her hands covering her face, the designer handbag resting forgotten on the floor beside her. The narrative of her perfect, privileged life had been incinerated in a matter of minutes. Richard stared blankly at the mahogany grain of the table, a defeated, broken man who had gambled his legacy and lost everything. I had torn down the final pillars of their shared delusion. I had taken their most potent weapons, the guilt, the gaslighting, the fabricated history, and snapped them in half with cold, hard evidence. I felt a profound, sweeping sense of peace settle over my chest. The terrified girl from the airport bathroom was gone forever, replaced by a woman forged in the fires of their cruelty. But the reckoning was not quite finished. The door handle to the boardroom clicked, the heavy frosted glass swinging open to reveal the true architect of Sterling Capital, the man who had waited decades to face the people who stole his daughter. The heavy frosted glass doors glided open on their brushed steel tracks. The quiet click of the latch drew every eye away from the damning evidence scattered across the table and toward the threshold. Jonathan Sterling stepped into the room. He wore a dark charcoal suit, his silver hair catching the morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He did not storm into the boardroom or raise his voice. He carried the quiet, formidable gravity of a man who built empires and dismantled rivals before breakfast. He walked the length of the mahogany table, his footsteps making no sound against the thick carpet. He bypassed Richard and Chad entirely, treating them as if they were insignificant dust motes floating in his domain. He stopped directly behind my chair. I felt the warm, heavy weight of his hand resting on my shoulder. It was a gesture of profound pride, a physical barrier declaring that I was protected, valued, and permanently out of their reach. Beatrice shrank back into the leather upholstery. The sight of her former victimizer, the man she had extorted and blackmailed for over a decade, standing victorious in a multi-billion-dollar headquarters, stripped the breath from her lungs. She had spent 20 years convincing herself that Jonathan was a pathetic, broken addict cowering in the woods. Facing the sleek, commanding reality of the venture capitalist destroyed the bedrock of her delusions. "Hello, Beatrice," Jonathan said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that commanded total attention. "It has been quite a long time." Beatrice opened her mouth, her jaw trembling, but her vocal cords refused to cooperate. She looked at the polished silver cufflinks on his sleeves, at the undeniable wealth radiating from his posture, and then at me, the daughter sitting at his right hand. "You tried to send my daughter to the slums," Jonathan continued, his hazel eyes locking onto her terrified gaze with chilling precision. "You thought you were discarding a burden. You thought you were burying her in the mud. Instead, you sent her to the throne." The words hung in the sterile, climate-controlled air. They were a definitive verdict, closing the chapter on 20 years of theft and manipulation. Jonathan gave my shoulder one final, affirming squeeze, then took a step back, yielding the floor. This was my boardroom. This was my execution to carry out. I turned my attention back to the men sitting across from me. The emotional reckoning was over. It was time for the financial autopsy. I picked up a slender, cream-colored manila folder resting at the edge of my blotter. I did not slide it toward the center of the table right away. I held it in my hands, feeling the crisp texture of the heavy cardstock, drawing out the suspense. "Chad," I said, my tone reverting to the clinical detachment of a senior partner, "you came to Seattle today expecting Sterling Capital to reject your bailout proposal. Or, in your wildest fantasies, you hoped we would foolishly sign a term sheet absorbing your toxic liabilities." Chad wiped a bead of sweat from his temple, his eyes darting to the folder in my hands. His breathing was shallow and rapid. He nodded slowly, too terrified to speak. "Sterling Capital is not rejecting your loan application," I explained, leaning forward slightly, "because Sterling Capital is not involved in this transaction at all. I did not use firm resources to review your portfolio. I reviewed it independently." I tossed the cream folder onto the mahogany surface. It slid smoothly, coming to a halt directly in front of Chad's trembling hands. "Over the past 6 months, I have been monitoring the public filings of your creditors," I detailed, watching the color drain further from his cheeks. "When the primary lender called the loan on your Miami project, your secondary creditors panicked. They wanted out of the blast radius. They were willing to offload your distressed debt for pennies on the dollar just to clear their ledgers." Richard leaned in, his brow furrowed in panicked confusion. "What are you saying?" he choked out, the reality struggling to penetrate his ingrained entitlement. "I am saying that I took the bonuses I earned from closing 4 major acquisitions this year," I stated, the cold facts landing like hammer blows. "I utilized my personal capital. I formed a blind trust under a shell corporation, and I purchased your debt. All of it." Chad scrambled to open the folder. His frantic fingers tore at the paper. He stared at the legal documents inside, his eyes scanning the dense paragraphs of legalese, searching for a loophole that did not exist. He saw the official transfer deeds, the notarized signatures, the undeniable proof of ownership changing hands. "I own the defaulted mezzanine loan on the Miami property," I continued, ticking the items off on my fingers. "I own the secondary mortgages on your commercial strip malls. And most importantly, I hold the primary note on the residential estate in Boca Raton." Beatrice let out a strangled, high-pitched noise, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. The country club mansion, the fortress of her elite social status, the grand foyer with the abstract paintings, the mahogany dining table where she had handed me my eviction notice. It no longer belonged to the bank. It belonged to the daughter she had exiled. "You do not owe faceless creditors anymore," I said, maintaining unyielding eye contact with Chad. "You owe me, and I am calling the debts due today." Chad collapsed forward, his elbows hitting the table, his face burying into his hands. His shoulders shook violently. He was weeping. The arrogant, slick real estate broker who had laughed at my clearance rack dress was now shedding literal tears onto the mahogany grain, fully comprehending that his career, his firm, and his fraudulent empire were vaporized. The documents in that folder were not negotiation points. They were formal notices of foreclosure. I was seizing the assets, every single one of them. Brittany sat frozen beside her husband. The reality of impending poverty crashed over her. The designer bags, the expensive Pilates studios, the brand new Range Rovers, they were all gone. The credit cards in her purse were now useless pieces of plastic. She looked at me, her eyes wide, brimming with a pathetic, desperate realization. She was pregnant. She had no marketable skills, no income stream, and a husband facing potential federal fraud investigations. She clutched her expensive leather handbag against her chest, her knuckles stark white against the dark material. "Aubrey," Brittany whispered, her voice cracking, pleading for a sisterly bond she had spent 2 decades mocking. "Please, what are we supposed to do? Where are we supposed to go?" I looked at my sister. I saw the girl who had sneered at my waitressing uniform. I saw the woman who had texted me to enjoy the slums while I sat terrified on a rainy tarmac. I saw the person who giggled while my mother threw me out of my childhood home. I felt no pity. I felt the profound, serene clarity of a ledger balancing to 0. I gathered my pen and placed it neatly beside my notepad. I folded my hands together. I offered her the exact same tight manicured smile our mother had given me 4 years ago at the country club dinner. "I would love to help you, Brittany," I said, my voice crisp, echoing through the silent boardroom. "But I think it is time you truly spread your wings." The silence that followed my final statement was thick enough to suffocate the entire room. The words hung in the chilled, climate-controlled air, a precise mirroring of the cruelty they had inflicted upon me 4 years prior. Brittany stared at me, her mouth parting in a silent gasp, the color draining from her face until her skin matched the stark white porcelain shards scattered across the table. She clutched her expensive leather handbag against her chest as a shield, but no amount of imported Italian leather could protect her from the financial ruin crashing over her pristine life. Richard was the first to fracture. His patriarchal authority, the foundation of his entire identity, was being dismantled by a woman he had spent decades treating like an unpaid servant. He could not process the defeat. The cognitive dissonance was too profound. He shoved his ergonomic leather chair backward, the wheels scraping harshly against the thick carpet. He stood up, his face flushing a deep, dangerous crimson. "You think you can just steal my legacy?" Richard bellowed, his voice cracking, losing its practiced baritone resonance. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me, his chest heaving under his tailored suit. "I will tie you up in litigation for the next decade. I have the best attorneys in Florida on retainer. I will sue you for predatory acquisition. I will drag Sterling Capital through the mud until you beg me to settle." I did not raise my voice to meet his shouting. I did not need to. I held the high ground, and we both knew his threats were nothing more than the desperate flailing of a drowning man. "You do not have any attorneys on retainer." "Richard," I replied, my tone even and clinical, projecting the serene confidence of someone holding all the winning cards. "I read your operational ledgers. You drained your legal defense funds 3 months ago to cover the margin calls on Chad's disastrous Miami venture. Your lawyers dropped you when your last 2 checks bounced." Richard's hand dropped. The bluster evaporated, replaced by a raw, unvarnished panic. He looked at Chad, seeking backup, but his son-in-law was staring blankly at the mahogany grain, paralyzed by the realization that his career was incinerated. "You signed the default clauses," I continued, detailing the mechanics of his demise with surgical precision. "When you missed 3 consecutive development milestones, Your primary lenders executed their right to sell your distressed debt. I purchased it on the open market, legally and transparently through a blind trust. There is no lawsuit, Richard. There is only a foreclosure. The bank owns nothing. I own everything. The irrefutable truth of his powerlessness finally penetrated his stubborn ego. Richard sank back into his chair, a deflated, hollow shell of the arrogant socialite who had swaggered into the lobby just an hour ago. Watching the patriarch of the family surrender triggered a final, desperate panic in my mother. Beatrice realized that intimidation had failed and logic was useless. She reverted to the only strategy she had left, deploying a twisted, weaponized version of maternal affection. She lunged across the polished wood. Her sudden movement sent the remaining droplets of spilled espresso flying. She reached for me, her hands extending across the table, her manicured fingers frantic. She managed to brush the sleeve of my bespoke suit, attempting to seize my wrists, trying to establish a physical connection to anchor her emotional manipulation. "Aubrey, please," Beatrice wailed, her voice a high, grating pitch of artificial sorrow. Her face contorted into a mask of pure desperation, fresh tears streaking through her heavy foundation. "You cannot do this. I am your mother." I did not flinch, but I did not let her touch me. I stood up smoothly, pushing my chair back, stepping out of her reach. I looked down at her, observing the frantic weeping woman who had spent 20 years conditioning me to believe I was worthless. I felt no anger, no sorrow, and no lingering need for her approval. I felt a profound, chilling emptiness toward her. "You are not my mother, Beatrice," I said, my voice echoing off the glass walls, stripping away the final layer of her delusion. She froze, her hands hovering uselessly over the mahogany surface. "You were my landlord," I stated, delivering the truth with cold, unyielding clarity, "and my lease expired 4 years ago." The words struck her like a physical blow. She recoiled, her hands dropping to her sides. The performance shattered. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with the horrifying realization that the emotional tethers she had used to control me were severed permanently. There were no buttons left to push, no guilt left to leverage. She was staring at a stranger. I reached out and pressed a discreet button located on the underside of the conference table. Within 10 seconds, the heavy frosted glass doors glided open. Thomas stood in the doorway, projecting an aura of quiet, immovable authority. Flanking him were 2 large security personnel dressed in immaculate dark suits. They did not carry weapons, but their posture communicated a zero-tolerance policy for any further disruptions. "Please escort our guests out of the building," I instructed, my gaze remaining fixed on the ruined family sitting before me. "They have concluded their business here." The security guards stepped into the room, their movements synchronized and highly professional. One guard approached Richard, gesturing politely but firmly toward the exit. The other moved toward Chad and Brittany. There was no physical altercation. The sheer presence of the security team, combined with the crushing weight of their financial ruin, drained whatever fight they had left. Chad stood up slowly, moving like an automaton, his eyes glazed over. He did not look at me. He simply shuffled toward the door, a broken salesman, stripped of his pitch. Brittany scrambled to gather her designer handbag, her hands shaking so severely she nearly dropped it. She kept her head bowed, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room, suffocated by the shame of her newfound reality. Richard stood up, attempting to adjust his suit jacket, trying to salvage a microscopic fraction of his dignity. It was a pathetic gesture. He walked out of the boardroom without uttering another word, his shoulders slumped, his commanding presence entirely erased. Beatrice was the last to move. She rose from her chair, her breathing shallow and ragged. She looked around the opulent boardroom, taking in the panoramic views of the Seattle skyline, the expensive leather, the polished wood, realizing this was a world she would never be allowed to enter again. She turned toward the exit, her posture crumbling. I remained standing at the head of the table. I watched them walk through the heavy double doors, stepping out into the long, glass-walled corridor. I followed their slow, agonizing procession with my eyes. The executive floor of Sterling Capital was not empty. Junior analysts, senior partners, and administrative staff were moving through the hallways, conducting the daily business of a multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm. They paused, stepping aside to watch the unusual spectacle. The Florida socialites, stripped of their arrogance and escorted by security, were paraded past dozens of high-powered executives. It was a quiet, devastating walk of shame. There were no raised voices, no dramatic shouting matches. It was the clean, surgical removal of toxic elements from a healthy environment. I walked slowly toward the threshold of the boardroom, standing in the open doorway to watch their final departure. They reached the expansive elevator bay at the end of the hall. Thomas pressed the call button. The polished stainless steel doors slid open instantly with a soft chime. The security guards waited as Richard, Chad, and Brittany stepped into the confined space, their heads bowed, refusing to look back. Beatrice stepped in last. Before she turned around, she paused. She slowly rotated her head, looking down the long corridor, her tear-streaked face seeking mine one final time. I stood in the doorway, framed by the wealth and power I had earned, my posture straight, my expression serene. I did not offer a vindictive smile. I simply offered nothing. The metal elevator doors began to slide together. Beatrice's weeping face narrowed into a thin slice, her expression a mix of profound regret and lingering terror, before the steel panels met with a quiet, definitive click. They were gone. The faint hum of the descending elevator cables faded into the ambient noise of the building. The corridor returned to its normal rhythm. The executives went back to their offices. The analysts returned to their spreadsheets. The interruption was over. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool, crisp air of the Pacific Northwest. A physical weight, a heavy, suffocating pressure I had carried in my chest since childhood, evaporated entirely. The phantom chains of their judgment, their gaslighting, and their endless demands dissolved into nothingness. I turned back into the boardroom. The space was quiet again. The shattered porcelain cup and the spilled espresso on the table were the only physical evidence that the confrontation had ever occurred. Jonathan was standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the churning waters of the Puget Sound. He turned to face me as I walked back toward the table. His expression was soft, stripped of his usual corporate intensity. He did not offer a celebratory speech. He did not ask how I felt. He simply understood. We looked at each other across the polished mahogany. I offered a slow, deliberate nod. He returned the gesture, a quiet, mutual acknowledgement of a war that had finally been won. The past was permanently severed, and the future belonged entirely to me. 6 months have passed since the doors of the 40th floor elevator closed on my former family. I have not spoken to them since, but the financial ripples of that single afternoon in Seattle were loud enough to reach me without a single phone call. In the world of high-stakes commercial real estate, word travels with vicious speed. When I formally executed the foreclosure notices on the Hartley Group properties, the dominoes fell exactly as the numbers had predicted. Chad's fragile empire collapsed instantly. Without the illusion of liquidity, his remaining investors panicked and pulled out, triggering a cascade of secondary lawsuits that tied him up in litigation he could not afford to fight. Richard and Beatrice fared no better. The Boca Raton mansion, the fortress of their social superiority, was seized and liquidated. The country club membership, the very foundation of my mother's identity, was unceremoniously revoked when their dues went unpaid. I heard through Thomas, who occasionally monitors the public filings to ensure they never attempt contact, that the reality of their new lives is a profound study in poetic justice. Richard, stripped of his bravado and his bank accounts, was forced to accept a mid-level, salaried management position at a regional logistics firm, taking orders from executives half his age. Brittany's brand new Range Rover, the vehicle she paraded around Florida while I worked triple shifts at the diner, was repossessed from the driveway of a rented townhouse. She gave birth to her second child in a public hospital, miles away from the private luxury suites she had bragged about online. But the most striking reversal of fortune belonged to Beatrice, the woman who had meticulously orchestrated my eviction, the mother who had weaponized my childhood bedroom simply to accommodate her favorite daughter's fitness routine, was forced to confront the harsh reality of the service industry. Beatrice, who had spent decades treating waiters, valets, and her own daughter like invisible, disposable labor, is now working the front desk at a local Pilates studio in Boca Raton. She spends her days checking in wealthy patrons, handing out clean towels, and sanitizing yoga mats for the women who used to attend her lavish luncheons. I do not feel guilt. I do not feel pity. I feel a profound, unshakable peace. Their ruin was not an act of malicious revenge. It was simply the inevitable consequence of their own arrogant, fraudulent choices colliding with an immovable boundary. I did not destroy them. I simply removed the safety net they had constructed out of my silent obedience. I sit in the living room of my own home now, a quiet, modern sanctuary nestled in the hills overlooking Lake Washington. The rain is falling steadily outside, a rhythmic, comforting sound that I have grown to love. It no longer feels like a reflection of isolation. It feels like the steady pulse of a city that allowed me to resurrect my life. If you are watching this, if you are sitting somewhere right now feeling the crushing weight of a family that measures your worth by your utility, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Sometimes, the people who try to bury you do not realize they are planting you in better soil. You do not owe your future to the people who made your past unbearable. You do not have to endure their cruelty under the false obligation of shared blood. Family is not a title they are automatically granted. It is a privilege they must earn through respect and unconditional support. When they tell you that you are nothing, when they try to strip away your confidence and isolate you from your own potential, remember that their cruelty is a reflection of their own profound insecurity, not your value. Walking away is not an act of failure. It is not an admission of defeat. Walking away is the most powerful declaration of self-respect you will ever make. It is the moment you reclaim the narrative and decide that your life belongs entirely to you. I am packing my bags this evening. I am not stuffing everything I own into 2 scuffed suitcases at 2 a.m. I am carefully folding designer clothing into a hard-shell carry-on. I am leaving tomorrow for a 3-week vacation across Europe, flying first class to celebrate the closing of a major acquisition that I negotiated entirely on my own. I walk into my home office to retrieve my passport. The room is quiet, illuminated by the soft glow of a desk lamp. I open the heavy steel safe hidden behind a false panel in the bookshelf. Inside, resting on the velvet lining, are my travel documents, a stack of international currency, and the physical proof of my independence. But my eyes do not linger on the money or the passport. Sitting on the shelf next to the safe is a small, sleek frame. Inside the polished glass rests the $89 one-way economy flight itinerary. The paper is slightly yellowed now, the black ink of my mother's cruelty preserved permanently under the glass. I reach out and touch the smooth surface of the frame. I trace the outline of the destination printed on the paper: Seattle Tacoma International Airport. I smile, a genuine expression of profound gratitude for the terrifying, defining moment that ticket represented. I pick up my passport, close the heavy steel door of the safe, and spin the dial, locking it securely. I turn off the desk lamp, plunging the office into a peaceful darkness, and walk out the door, the rolling wheels of my suitcase gliding smoothly across the hardwood floor. My family thought they were handing me a one-way ticket to rock bottom. They thought they were launching me into a life of inescapable poverty and isolation. They were so confident in their cruelty, so certain that without them I would simply cease to exist. They were right about exactly one thing. It was a one-way trip. I never looked back.
The story of Aubrey Susan is not just a tale of corporate retribution or a dramatic reversal of fortune. Beneath the surface of tailored suits, mahogany boardrooms, and shattered espresso cups lies a profound examination of the American family. It is a mirror held up to the values we claim to hold dear: loyalty, support, and the unconditional nature of a parent's love. And a stark reminder of what happens when those values are distorted by ego and greed. For parents, Aubrey's journey serves as a powerful, uncomfortable cautionary tale about the very foundation of family education. In traditional American culture, we often speak of the family as a sanctuary, a place where children are nurtured and prepared for the world. But what happens when that sanctuary is commodified? Beatrice and Richard did not see Aubrey as a daughter. They saw her as a resource. They treated her as unpaid staff, utilizing her to balance their books and manage their messes until she was no longer a useful tax write-off. This is the ultimate failure of parenting, viewing a child through a lens of utility. When love becomes transactional, the family structure rots from the inside out. The narrative also highlights the insidious danger of the golden child versus scapegoat dynamic. By elevating Brittany and Chad and allowing them to mock Aubrey's state school education and her relentless work ethic, Beatrice and Richard created an environment where cruelty was normalized. They rewarded entitlement while punishing ambition. True family values must be rooted in fairness, recognizing and celebrating the unique efforts of each child, rather than pitting them against one another for parental approval. When parents play favorites, they don't just damage the scapegoat. They cripple the golden child, leaving them ill-equipped for a world that does not cater to their every whim. We see this when Chad's fraudulent empire crumbles the moment Aubrey is no longer there to prop it up. Furthermore, Aubrey's story underscores that integrity in parenting is non-negotiable. Beatrice's entire existence was built on a foundation of lies, extorting Jonathan, forging emancipation letters, and fabricating narratives about his poverty to keep Aubrey dependent and terrified. A family built on deception is a house of cards. It may look impressive from the outside, gleaming with the polish of country club prestige, but it will inevitably collapse when exposed to the truth. Honesty and transparency are not just moral imperatives. They are the bedrock of trust that a child needs to feel secure. And perhaps most importantly, the story challenges the notion that parenting ends at 18. Beatrice and Richard used Aubrey's adulthood as a convenient excuse to exile her, claiming it was time for her to truly spread her wings, when they simply wanted her bedroom for a Pilates studio. But Jonathan Sterling demonstrates what true parental guidance looks like. He offered Aubrey mentorship, a place in his firm, and the unconditional parental pride she had been denied her entire life. He didn't just give her wealth. He gave her the emotional support necessary to heal and thrive. A parent's responsibility to guide, support, and love their child does not expire with a high school diploma. For young people, Aubrey's journey is a masterclass in resilience and the reclamation of self-worth. It is a testament to the idea that you are not defined by the limitations placed upon you by others. Aubrey's realization that sometimes the people who try to bury you don't realize they are planting you in better soil is perhaps the most resonant lesson of all. Adversity, even profound betrayal, does not have to be an endpoint. It can be the catalyst for extraordinary growth. When her family handed her a one-way ticket to rock bottom, Aubrey refused to succumb to their expectations. She took that ticket and flew toward her own potential. Her success was not an accident, nor was it merely handed to her by a wealthy father. Aubrey earned her power. She leveraged the finance degree she had funded through waitressing, starting at the bottom of Sterling Capital and grinding her way to vice president of acquisitions. She proved her financial brilliance through hard work, demonstrating that merit and competence are the ultimate equalizers against those who underestimate you. Aubrey also teaches a vital lesson about boundaries and self-protection in the modern age. Her decision to keep digital receipts recording the verbal abuse at her graduation dinner, was a crucial act of self-preservation. It allowed her to anchor herself in reality when her family tried to gaslight her. Similarly, her choice to maintain absolute digital silence while she built her new life demonstrates that true healing often requires the surgical removal of toxic influences. You cannot heal in the same environment that broke you. Knowledge, as Aubrey proves in the boardroom, is the ultimate weapon. Because she had done the grueling work of organizing her family's fraudulent books, she possessed the leverage needed to dismantle their lies and protect herself from their manipulation. Education and competence are armor. Aubrey's story redefines what loyalty means within a traditional family structure. Loyalty is not a blank check written in blood. It is a two-way street built on mutual respect and truth. The Florida family demanded loyalty based on the mere fact of their existence, while offering nothing but exploitation in return. But the family Aubrey built with Jonathan in Seattle shows that true bonds are forged through unconditional support, not obligation. If this exploration of family, resilience, and the difficult choices we must sometimes make resonates with you, I invite you to join our community. Please subscribe to the Sophia Told Stories channel for more narratives that dig deep into the complexities of the human experience. We share stories that challenge us, comfort us, and remind us that we are never truly alone in our struggles. In the end, we must ask ourselves, what kind of legacy are we building? Are we constructing families based on utility and ego, or are we cultivating environments of genuine support and unconditional love? When the inevitable storms of life arrive, and the facades we present to the world are stripped away, what will remain? Will we be left standing in the ruins of our own arrogance? Or will we find ourselves anchored by the truth we have nurtured? The answer, as always, lies in the choices we make today, in the quiet moments when no one else is watching, and in the way we treat those who depend on us the most.